Today we're continuing our sermon series called Unafraid. And this series is based on the book by Reverend Adam Hamilton from the Church of the Resurrection in Leawood, Kansas. And the book has the same name as the series. In this series, we've been looking at various fears, things that we might be afraid of, whether it's fear in general or fear of other people. Last week we looked at fear of being alone and loneliness. And today we are looking at fear of failure. And for some of you, this may really resonate with you. Because fear of failure is one of the most prevalent fears that we have as human beings. And so today I am continuing the story from Exodus, the story of Moses, although I'm skipping a few parts. I'm reading, beginning with chapter 4, verse 1. I'll read verses 1 through 5 and then verses 10 through 13. And I'm also reading from the Common English Bible. Then Moses replied, "But what if they don't believe me or pay attention to me? They might say, 'The Lord didn't appear to you.' The Lord said, 'What's in your hand?' Moses replied, 'A shepherd's rod.' The Lord said, 'Throw it down on the ground.' So Moses threw it on the ground, and it turned into a snake. Moses jumped back from it. Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Reach out and grab the snake by the tail.' So Moses reached out and grabbed it, and it turned back into a rod in his hand. 'Do this so that they will believe that the Lord, the God of their ancestors, Abraham's God, Isaac's God, and Jacob's God, has in fact appeared to you.' But Moses said to the Lord, 'My Lord, I've never been able to speak well, not yesterday, not the day before, and certainly not now, since you've been talking to your servant. I have a slow mouth and a thick tongue.' Then the Lord said to him, 'Who gives people the ability to speak? Who's responsible for making them unable to speak or hard of hearing, sighted or blind? Isn't it I, the Lord? Now go, I'll help you speak, and I'll teach you what you should say.' But Moses said, 'Please, my Lord, just send someone else.'" May God add wisdom to the reading, hearing, and understanding of these words. I really love Moses. Not the larger-than-life Moses that we learn about in Sunday school, or the Moses who was brought to life by Charlton Heston in that classic film, The 10 Commandments. No, I like the Moses we just heard about in Scripture. The one who was vulnerable. The one who had issues. The one who was human, like all of us. We read about Moses throughout the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. And to be fair, he did some amazing things, like parting the Red Sea, extracting water from a stone, and leading God's people, probably well over 1 million, from slavery in Egypt to the edge of the Promised Land. But in the story we heard this morning, we see a very different Moses, a human Moses, who hears God's voice and is terrified by what God is asking him to do. God wants Moses to do a really important task, but Moses doesn't want to. So at first he politely declines. "Who am I to go to Pharaoh and to bring the Israelites to Egypt?" But God is relentless. God persists. God repeats God's request no less than 3 times. And Moses comes up with excuse after excuse why he's not the right guy for the job. until finally, out of fear and complete desperation, Moses begs, "Please, my Lord, just send someone else." Now, I can relate to that, Moses, can't you? God wanted him to do something big, really big. And Moses didn't want to because he was afraid. Now, we don't know exactly what it was that he was afraid of, although we certainly can surmise maybe it was Pharaoh. Maybe he was afraid of Pharaoh. After all, it was Pharaoh who intended to kill Moses because Moses had murdered an Egyptian overseer 40 years before. Heck, I'd be afraid of Pharaoh too. Or maybe Moses' fear was bigger than that. Maybe he was afraid to fail. Maybe he was afraid of letting God down. Think about it. Imagine, if you will, Moses goes to Egypt, but Pharaoh is not convinced. Pharaoh will not let God's people go. And Moses is branded a failure. His name and his legacy is but a footnote in the biblical text. Like the other obscure characters, men like Ehud and Korah and Balaam and Jabez. In fact, the more I think about it, the more convinced I am that Moses was afraid to fail. You know why? Because his arguments with God were the same as mine when I first felt God's call upon my life. It was the mid-1990s. Our children were still quite young, and my husband David was in grad school at ASU. I was serving as a leader at our camp up on Mingus Mountain when I felt God calling me to something. Now, at the time, I didn't know exactly what it was God intended, but over the years, it became quite clear that God wanted me to serve a church as a pastor, as an elder in the United Methodist Church. And like Moses, I thought up every excuse in the book why this wasn't a good idea. I remember thinking things like, my children are little, they're small, they need their mother at home. Or my husband's a graduate student, I need to work to provide for our family. Or how about this one? I've got a good job that pays me really well. Why would I want to give that up? Or this, I can't afford to go back to school. Or this, I'm too old or too busy. Yes, over the years, the excuses continued to pile up. And while each of them was valid, at least in my mind, they weren't the real reason why I was saying no to God. I felt inadequate. I felt unprepared. My own fear of failure held me back from saying yes to God. Now, fear of failure, or aticophobia, say that 3 times fast. Aticophobia? Did I say that right? I hope so. Anyway, it is a phobia that is characterized by the inability to attempt any goal that is not a guaranteed success. Those who suffer from this phobia lack confidence in their ability to complete a task. And they often believe if there's a chance they might fail, there is no point in even trying, so they just don't. They experience intense worry when they imagine the awful things that might happen if they fail. At best, their fear makes them sabotage themselves, keeping them from trying new things or taking advantage of new opportunities. And at worst, they become powerless and paralyzed from doing even the simplest task. In either case, the fear of failure can make us miss out on exciting opportunities. It can hold us back from fully experiencing life, thus reducing our overall happiness. According to Dr. Guy Winch, a psychologist and an author and a speaker, and he's also an expert in emotional health, he writes, fear of failure is where the prospect of failing presents such a significant psychological threat, that motivation to avoid it exceeds the motivation to succeed. In other words, fear of failure is serious and troubling and has the potential to affect our mental and physical health. It can lead to bad decisions and can affect our relationships with others. And if we possess it or we know someone who does, we need to take it seriously and do something about it. Now, before we get too deep into the subject of fear of failure, I need to mention one thing, and that is this, that failure is really not a bad thing. Failure is inevitable because, newsflash, nobody's perfect. Failure can actually be positive because we learn more when we fail than we do when we succeed. And when we are willing to fail, we are more likely to take risks, which often results in greater rewards. Failure allows us to discover new things about ourselves. And when we fail, even multiple times, it makes success all the better. We need to fail in order to succeed. Consider this product. It was invented by a team led by Norman Larson, a chemist at the Rocket Chemical Company in San Diego, California. They were trying to develop a formula that would prevent corrosion by displacing water. And they didn't get it right until the 40th try. Hence the name of the product, water displacement, or WD, number 40. You didn't know that, did you? You learned something new. My job is done. Imagine, though, if the team had developed a fear of failure and they gave up after number 39. So, if failure is such a good thing, why then do we fear it? Well, Dr. Winch suggests it's because of the way that failure causes us to feel shame. He writes, people who have a fear of failure are motivated to avoid failing not because they cannot manage the basic emotions of disappointment, anger, and frustration that accompany such experiences, but because failing also makes them feel deep, deep shame, which is a psychologically toxic emotion that makes us feel bad about who we are. When we fail, instead of feeling bad about our actions, we tend to feel bad about ourselves. We feel shame. And that shame eats away at our self-esteem. Now, for some, shame can be a motivating force, which makes them want to get up off of their behinds and get the job done at all costs, no matter what it takes. But for others, especially those afraid to fail, shame shoves them back into their shells because their low self-esteem and deflated self-image cannot bear the thought of the pain and embarrassment, the shame of having failed. So, what then causes us to be afraid to fail? Well, it depends on who you talk to. It depends on the source. But there are a number of causes that are consistent across the board, and I'd like to share with you just a few. First, fear of failure comes right from their family of origin, their parents. If our parents were hypercritical, or established ultimatums and carried them out, or they ran the household with fear-based rules, then we might be inclined to be afraid to fail, not just as children, but also as adults. Second, for some, fear of failure comes from a tendency to have to be perfect. In fact, perfectionism is one of the main reasons why people are afraid to fail. For perfectionists, failure can be humiliating It isn't just a terrible thing, it's an assault on our character. So rather than fail, often perfectionists won't even try. Third, some develop a fear of failure due to a tendency to over-personalize things. That is, they tend to take things too personally. For them, failure is a testament to who they are, not what they did. And when they fail, it is a personal affront, which results in negative self-talk and in feelings of inadequacy. And finally, some develop a fear of failure because their self-confidence is fragile. Those with true confidence know they won't always succeed, but those whose confidence is fractured or has been fractured tend to avoid taking risks. They play it safe rather than try something new, allowing that fear of failure to take hold. Now, you might also be experiencing fear of failure if, according to Dr. Winch, the following criteria are very characteristic of you. Take a look at these and see if any of these ring true for you. 1, failing makes you worry about what other people think about you. 2, failing makes you worry about your ability to pursue the future that you want. 3, failing makes you worry about how smart or how capable you are. 4, failing makes you worry about disappointing people whose opinion you value. 5, you tend to tell people that you don't expect to succeed in order to lower their expectations. 6, you get last-minute headaches or other physical symptoms that prevent you from completing a task. 7, you get distracted by things that seem important, but in hindsight really aren't, and the distraction makes you fail. And 8, you procrastinate. Then you run out of time and never get the task completed. Any of those ring a bell? Well, they do for me. In fact, when I looked at that list and also the one before it, I have to say, yeah, that's me. You see, I was raised by parents who had high expectations and who I wanted to please at all costs. I am also a perfectionist by nature, and many of you already know that by now. I also tend to take things too personally, especially when I'm criticized, even by those who mean well. There were times in my life when my self-confidence was broken, when it was fragile, and sometimes that lack of self-confidence returns. It's something I still battle. I worry about what others will think of me. If I'm good enough, or smart enough, or capable enough. I worry about people being disappointed in me. And yes, I procrastinate. I let distractions get the best of my time. When I write a sermon, I write multiple drafts. I think what you're hearing right now is draft number 5. And throughout that process, I worry if it's good enough, if you'll get something out of it. And as I stand before you every Sunday, I worry that someday one of you might leave the church because of something I said that offended you. I worry about the order of worship. I worry about the slides and the music. It's exhausting and often stressful. But I know it's because I have possessed throughout my life a fear of failure. And knowing that is half the battle. But I'll tell you something else. Throughout my life, I have worked and I continue to work very, very hard so that my fear won't get the best of me. Because I don't want to feel powerless. I don't want to be paralyzed by an irrational fear. I want to experience the fullness of life and fulfill God's purpose for me. So what have I done about my own fear of failure, and what can you do as well? Well, I will tell you, therapy helps. But my relationship with God helps me more. I think about these words from 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 7, which say, God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. That ought to just be on the wall everywhere, don't you think? God's desire for us is that we do not live in fear. So when we do, we have to trust in God's presence, even as we work to alleviate our fears. Now, throughout this series, I've offered you a few practical tips on how you might deal with some of these different fears. And this time is no different. I have a few things to offer you if you suffer from fear of failure like I do. First, figure out why you're afraid to fail. Look for that root cause. Reflect on the causes that I mentioned moments ago, or do some research on your own. Once you have figured out the root cause of your failure, your fear of failure, then name it, write it down, post it somewhere, because naming that source and putting it out in the open can take away its power over you. Second, reframe your belief about your task or goal and realize that failure is an option. Include the idea that you just might learn something new, or you might improve your skills in the process of completing that task. Next, visualize all the possible outcomes, including the worst case scenario. Uncertainty is terrifying for those of us who are afraid to fail. So knowing what could happen will prepare us for the worst. And then have a backup plan. Hope for the best and prepare for the worst. I used to say that all the time. Your backup plan will give you the confidence you need, and it might even inspire you to take a bit of a risk. Next, learn from your experience, good or bad. Even if things don't go as planned, that does not mean you failed. Learn from what happened, adopt changes, and grow. And finally, adopt a positive attitude. You are what you believe. And I know this one is going to be hard, but eliminate negative self-talk, because all it does is bring you down. And last, finally, remember this, that even highly successful people failed.
After being cut from his high school basketball team, he went home, locked himself in his room, and cried. He wasn't able to speak until he was almost 4 years old, and his teachers said he would never amount to much. Was demoted from her job as a news anchor because she wasn't fit for television. Fired from a newspaper for lacking imagination and having no original ideas. At age 11, he was cut from his team after being diagnosed with a growth hormone deficiency, which made him smaller in stature than most kids his age. At 30 years old, he was left devastated and depressed after being unceremoniously removed from the company he started. A high school dropout whose personal struggles with drugs and poverty culminated in an unsuccessful suicide attempt. A teacher told him he was too stupid to learn anything and that he should go into a field where he might succeed by virtue of his pleasant personality. Rejected by Decca Recording Studios, who said, "We don't like their sound. They have no future in show business." His first book was rejected by 27 publishers. His fiancée died, failed in business, had a nervous breakdown, and was defeated in 8 elections. If you've never failed, you've never tried anything new.
So go out there and try something new. Don't be afraid to fail. Trust that God will always be with you, even when you fail. Amen.